She walked 9 miles through the first snow of November, with 61 cents in her pocket, and her mother's recipe book buttoned inside her coat, because the only other place to sleep that night was the floor of the immigration shed at Fort Macleod, and the shed had no stove. Marta Bruckner had buried her husband in June, lost her room over the harness shop in September, and by the last week of October, she was standing at the gate of a sheep ranch that every cattleman in the district had sworn to see fail. The man who opened that gate did not want to cook. He told her so before she had set her trunk down in the snow. What neither of them understood yet was that the winter coming would kill half the sheep between the Porcupine Hills and the Oldman River, and that she was the only reason his flock would come through it standing. If this story stays with you, press the like button and tell me in the comments what town you're listening from. I want to see how far across this country the story travels. The notice had been nailed to the door frame of Loveridge's store for 11 days, judging by the rust bleeding out of the nail head and down the paper. Cook and house help wanted for the winter. Ninebark Coulee, 9 miles west along the Beaver Creek Trail. Room board, $12 the month. Serious inquiries only. W. Trenholm. Somebody had drawn a crude sheep beside the name, and somebody else had crossed it out. Marta read it twice, standing with the wind pushing at the back of her skirt, and then she worked the nail loose with her thumbnail and folded the paper into her coat pocket, and that was Thursday. Friday morning, she began walking. The trail was 2 ruts in frozen grass with a skin of snow over it, and by the second mile she had learned to walk in the rut rather than on the crown, because the crown was where the wind got at her. She carried a trunk that had come with her from Bremen and had not aged well. The lock had given out somewhere between Halifax and Winnipeg, and she kept it shut now with a length of clothesline tied in a flat bow. Inside were 2 dresses, one for work and one for church, though she had not seen the inside of a church since June. A wool shawl her mother had knitted the year Marta turned 16, brown with a band of dull green at the fringe, a tin of needles, a whetstone, 4 buttons of good horn, because you did not throw away good buttons, and the recipe book, which was not really a recipe book but a ledger her mother had filled over 30 years with everything worth knowing: how to salt a hog in a warm autumn, how deep to sink a cellar so the frost line passed above it, how much lime to how much sulfur, what color a wound turns before it turns bad. Conrad had wanted the West. He had a cousin who wrote letters about wheat. Marta had wanted to stay in Winnipeg where there was work, and a German church and a doctor within 4 blocks, and she had lost that argument the way she lost most arguments with him, which was slowly and then all at once. They got as far as Fort Macleod before the fever took him. 9 days from the first headache to the burial. She had sold the wagon to pay the undertaker, and the team to pay for the room, and then the room ate the rest of it. And the woman who ran the boarding house was not cruel, only arithmetic. In September, she stood on the boardwalk with a trunk and $30. By the end of October, she had 61 cents, and she had counted it twice that morning, once at the pump and once at the store, because she did not trust her own hands anymore when they were cold. Ninebark Coulee did not announce itself. The trail bent around a shoulder of dun grass, and there it was below her, a long crooked seam in the prairie, with willow and ninebark growing thick along the bottom where the creek ran, and along the north bank a house with 2 stories and a stone chimney, a barn, a lambing shed with its door hanging crooked, and beyond that a set of pens, and beyond the pens, spread across the whole south slope like a gray lichen, the sheep. She stopped and looked at them a long while. She had never seen so many animals belonging to one man. She counted the ones she could see, and stopped counting at 300, and understood she was seeing perhaps a third of them. The man came out of the barn before she reached the gate. He was tall, and he had the walk of somebody whose knees hurt in cold weather, and who had decided not to mention it. He stopped at the gate and did not open it. "Help you with something. I've come about the notice." She held it up. He looked at it, and something in his jaw shifted. "That's 11 days old. Nobody else took it down. Nobody else would." He looked past her at the empty trail. "Where'd you come from?" "Fort Macleod today. This morning. You walked 9 miles. Yes." He looked at her boots. She let him. They were second-hand, and whoever had owned them before her had walked with a limp, so the right heel was scooped out on the outside edge, and she had been placing that foot wrong for a month, and had a blister below the ankle bone that she had stopped feeling around the 5th mile, which she knew was not a thing to be glad about. I put that notice up in October, he said. It's November. I've made other arrangements. What arrangements? He didn't answer that. The wind came up the coulee and pushed at both of them. What's your name? Marta Bruckner. You're German. Baden. We came over when I was 26. He looked at her for a moment more. Mr. Trenholm, she said, when he didn't speak. Wesley, he said. Nobody out here, says Mr. He put his hand on the gate, but he still didn't open it. I'll be straight with you, Mrs. Bruckner. There's no money in this place. Wool's gone to nothing. There's a stock association in this district that would be pleased to watch me starve, and half the men who ride for it were at my wedding. If you stay here, you're standing where I'm standing, and I've got a girl in that house who doesn't talk, doesn't, or can't. He looked at her sharply. It was the first thing she'd said that he hadn't already prepared an answer for. Doesn't, he said. Since her mother. Marta set the trunk down in the snow. Then I'll cook for 3, she said, and not talk at her. He opened the gate. The room was off the kitchen and had been a pantry before it was a room. There was a cot in it, and a shelf, and a window the size of a serving platter, and it was so cold she could see the shape of her own breath hanging over the bed. He stood in the doorway with the lamp and said, It's small, in the flat voice of a man expecting to be argued with. It has a door, she said. The last room I had didn't. He left the lamp. The girl was at the top of the stairs, sitting on the second step from the top with her arms around her knees, watching. 9 years old, maybe 10, with her father's straight dark hair and a face that gave away nothing at all. Marta looked up at her, once, and then went into the kitchen and started on the stove without looking again, because she had learned something about frightened animals from her father and had never found that it did not also apply to people. The stove had not been cleaned out properly in a season. The flue was choked. She scraped it and laid the fire, and found in the cellarway a slab of mutton, 3 withered turnips, an onion sprouting green, and a crock of drippings gone slightly rancid at the top, which she skimmed and set aside. There was flour, and there was salt. There was no cabbage, no carrot, no potato worth the name. Whatever they had put by in September, they had put by badly. She made a soup, and while it cooked, she looked at the kitchen the way her mother had taught her to look at a kitchen, which is the way a surveyor looks at ground. Half the crocks were unsealed. There was 100 weight of oats in a sack on the floor where mice could get at it. There was no root cellar door in the kitchen, which meant the cellar was outside, which in this country meant somebody would be walking across a yard in 40 below to fetch a turnip. The girl came down when the soup was on the table. She sat and she ate and she watched. Wesley ate 2 bowls and said nothing about them. But near the end of the meal, the girl set her spoon down and reached across and touched the back of Marta's wrist with 2 fingers, quick, the way you touch a stove to see if it's hot. Then she took her bowl to the basin and went upstairs. Wesley sat looking at the door she'd gone through for longer than the moment warranted. That's more than she's done in 2 years, he said. Marta had gone to sleep by 9 and woke at 2 because the sound of the wind had changed. It had been a steady push out of the northwest all evening, the ordinary complaining of wind through a coulee. Now it had dropped in pitch. It had got underneath itself somehow, and there was a low steady note in it, like a note held on a church organ with the bellows a-failing. And she lay for a moment in the dark with her eyes open, listening, because that was the sound her father had taught her to be afraid of. She dressed. She put her mother's shawl on over her coat and went out through the kitchen, and the door pushed back at her when she opened it. In the yard, the snow was moving sideways, and the barn was a shape rather than a building, and the lamp in the barn window was a smear. Wesley was in the barn with a lantern, harnessing. Go back in the house, he said. How many days of hay are stacked outside? He stopped with the collar half up. The stacks, she said. Are they fenced or open? Open, west of the pens. Then in 6 hours they'll be under a drift, and you won't find them until March. She was already reaching for the second harness. And the sheep will be standing on top of your hay, eating snow. You know sheep. I know winter. Where do you want them? He looked at her across the lantern. Whatever he'd been prepared to say, he didn't say it. He said, Coulee bottom. There's willow scrub. It'll break the wind, and they'll bunch there on their own if we get them started. They worked from 2 in the morning until the gray came up. Baptiste Ladouceur came out of the bunkhouse at 3, an older man with a face like tanned harness and a rosary in his coat pocket that he never mentioned and never took out, and the 3 of them moved sheep. Marta walked at the tail of the flock in the dark with a length of rope, and she learned in the first hour what she should have known already, which is that a sheep in a blizzard will lie down and let the snow bury it, and that the only cure is to keep it walking. Twice she got down on her knees in the drift, and got her arms under the belly of a ewe, and stood her up. The wind took the words out of Wesley's mouth before they reached her, and so they stopped using words. He would point. She would go. By 9 in the morning, the flock was in the willow bottom, in a gray packed mass, steaming, and the hay was under canvas and roped, and the three of them were standing in the lee of the barn, drinking coffee that had gone cold in the cups between the stove and the door. Baptiste said, "She stood up that big Cotswold ewe by herself. 200 pounds, that one." Wesley didn't say anything, but that evening at supper he said, without preamble, "The notice said $12. I'll pay 15. The notice said 12. I know what the notice said. Then pay 12, Marta said, and buy lime with the difference." He set down his fork. "Lime. I looked at the flock this morning while we were bringing them in. 6 ewes rubbing on the corral rails. 2 with the wool coming away over the shoulder." She looked at him. "How long has it been in your flock?" He was quiet for a while. "Since the ram sale," he said. "August. Sheep scab." Her father had called it die rodi and had treated it 4 times in her childhood, and each time it had been the same, and each time it had worked. She said so. She said the treatment was lime and sulfur boiled together and let stand until it went the color of strong tea, and every animal dipped to the ears, and then dipped again in 10 days because the eggs did not die the first time. She said the pens and the shed had to be lime-washed. She said the men had to boil their coats. "In November," Wesley said. "It won't wait for spring. Half of them are in lamb. Then dip them now, while they can still stand it," she said. "Or shear scab off dead ewes in March." He got up and went out to the barn, and she cleared the table, and she thought perhaps she had lost the job in a single evening, which would have been an unremarkable outcome for the year she was having. But at breakfast he had a scrap of paper in front of him with figures on it, and he pushed it across the table. "Show me," he said. They built the dipping trough out of 2-inch plank sawn from a spruce Wesley had been saving for a floor. It took 4 days. Baptiste set the fire pit. Marta boiled the lime and sulfur in a wash boiler behind the lambing shed, 30 pounds of lime to 20 of flowers of sulfur, and enough water to keep it moving, and the smell came off it yellow and thick, and sat in the coulee for a week, and she stirred it with a hoe handle, and watched the color turn. She had watched her father do this when she was 11. She had not thought about it in 20 years, and it came back to her hands whole, the way such things do, and she found she had to stop for a moment and stand with her forearm across her eyes, and pretend the sulfur had got at her. Nell Trenholm watched all of it. The girl came out every morning and sat on an upturned bucket at a distance of about 20 feet, which seemed to be a distance she had decided on privately. And she watched, and she had with her a school slate and a nub of chalk. She drew what she saw. She drew the trough, and she drew the fire, and she drew the sheep going in and coming out, and the drawings were not childish. They had the thing that good drawings have, which is that the person drawing had actually looked. On the 3rd day, Marta walked past the bucket, and without stopping, without turning her head, said, "The ears go under. If you don't put the ears under, the whole thing is wasted." Then she kept walking. Behind her, she heard the chalk start again. On the 7th day, the girl left the slate on the kitchen table, with the fire drawn on it, and the wash boiler, and on the far edge, a woman with a hoe handle whose sleeves were rolled up. Marta looked at it a long time. She did not say anything about it. She wiped the table around it, and left it where it was, and in the morning it was gone, and the girl was outside on her bucket. They dipped 1,140 sheep in the last week of November, twice each, and they lost 9, which was a better outcome than Marta had promised him. The 2nd month was harder than the first, because the first ran on the strangeness of everything. In December, the strangeness wore off, and left only the work, which was considerable, and the arithmetic, which was worse. She had understood from the first evening that the pantry was thin. It took her until the middle of December, going through the sheds with a lantern and a slate of her own, to understand how thin. The hay would carry them to the end of February if February was kind. The oats would not carry them at all. The wool clip of the previous summer had been freighted to Fort Macleod in July, and had sold in August into a market that had fallen out from under itself. The panic in the American banks that year had come north the way weather does, and the eastern mills had stopped buying. and the Czech Wesley Trenholm had waited 11 months, for had come back at less than half what he owed against it. She learned this not from him, but from a ledger she saw upside down on the kitchen table while she was reaching past him for the lamp, and she did not mention it for 3 weeks, because there is nothing useful in telling a man his situation is bad unless you have brought something else to put beside the information. So she went and looked at the neighbors instead. There were 3 within reach. Gunnar and Ingrid Halvorsen, on the flat east of the coulee, with good hay in stacks and a herd of milk cows and a boy of 14, and no cash whatever. Zebulon Crake, a bachelor, north across the ridge, who ran 40 head of cattle and had the deepest cellar in the district and would not have asked a neighbor for water if his house were burning. Baptiste said of him, that man would rather be right in a snowbank than wrong by a stove. And 3 miles west, Tom Bly and his wife and 4 children, one of them a boy of 16 named Silas, who did the work of a man and was paid in food. She met them at the Christmas gathering in the Halvorsens' front room, which was the only social occasion of the winter, and she went with her hands folded and her mouth shut, and she listened. Ingrid Halvorsen told her about the 2 cows that had gone lame in October. Tom Bly, who talked when he was frightened, told her about the note he had signed at the bank in September, and Zebulon Crake stood by the door with his hat in his hand and said nothing to anybody for 2 hours, and left first. Riding home in the sleigh with the girl asleep against her shoulder and the runners hissing, Marta said, 4 properties. 1 good cellar, 1 good hay, 1 good grain, 1 good herd, and none of them has all 4. Wesley kept his eyes on the horses. You've been counting, he said. I count everything. It's a bad habit, and it's kept me alive twice. He was quiet for the length of a mile. Say it, he said. She said it. 1 cellar, dug deeper and lined properly and shared. Feed pooled, weighed out weekly against a written schedule. 3 copies, 1 for each family and 1 for the neighbors to check against. Labor traded rather than paid. Silas Bly's hands and Peter Halvorsen's hands and Baptiste's judgment spread across 4 places instead of pooled at none. The Halvorsens' hay to the sheep's tallow and mutton to the billis, Crake's oats to the Halvorsens' cows, the milk back around. It was not charity. Charity broke down in February. It was a ledger. They won't do it, Wesley said. Crake won't. If Crake does it, the rest will follow him and never admit it. Then you'll have to talk to Crake. Yes, she said. She walked to Crake's place in the 2nd week of January, 4 miles over the ridge, in weather that made the inside of her nose freeze together each time she breathed. She found him shoveling a path to a haystack that he could have reached in 3 strides if he had gone around. He straightened up and leaned on the shovel and looked at her the way you look at a bill in the mail. She told him everything, the wool check and the oats and the hay and the frost line and the design of the cellar, which she had drawn out 3 times on the back of a flour sack. She did not soften any part of it, and she did not flatter him. She told him she needed his stores and his labor, and that she needed something else worth more, which was for the other 3 families to see him put his name to it. He listened all the way through. Then he said, You're asking me to mix my grain with Trenholm's grain and Bly's grain, and trust the weighing. I'm asking you to trust a written schedule, not a person. Same thing out here. Then trust me. You've hauled with me twice. You know what I am. Crake looked out at his frozen coulee for a long time. Where did Cook learn to lay out a cellar, he said. My mother. Her people dug them that way in the Black Forest for 200 years. 8 feet down, not 4. Straw packed between the earth wall and a timber lining, and a stovepipe for air with a damper on it, and a second door so you never open the cellar to the wind. She paused. It doesn't rot the potatoes. That's the whole trick. Everything else is shoveling, 8 feet down. In January, men have done harder things in worse cold, she said, to keep their families fed. He turned the shovel over in the snow. The Chinook Stock Association has sent a man to see me twice this fall, he said, not looking at her. About the sheep. She waited. I told him no both times. He paused. The 2nd time it took me longer to say. What do they want? They want the sheep off the bench and out of the district. They want Trenholm's lease, and they want the trail. He looked up. And they know things they've no business knowing. They knew the size of his clip before I did. Somebody in the lands office is telling them. Crake's eyes narrowed. That's a serious thing to say out loud. I have no proof, but I have the pattern of what they know and when they know it, and it isn't luck. She met his look. They're waiting for this winter to break somebody. You think they'd help it along. I think they'll stand very close and be very sorry." The wind lifted snow off the top of the stack and turned it in the air between them. "All right," Craig said at last. "My oats and my back. But I want to see the drawing before anybody breaks ground, and I want the cellar dug on Trenholm's ground, not Bly's." He pointed the shovel at her. "No disrespect to Tom Bly, but the man cannot hold a thing in his mouth, and I don't want Lucian Vane hearing our business at the store." They broke ground on the 18th of January, and it took 9 days instead of 4, because the ground below 3 feet was like breaking granite, and they worked it with a fire pit, thawing a foot at a time, banking coals over the face of it overnight, and digging out the softened earth in the morning. Silas Bly worked every day of it. Peter Halverson worked 6. Craig worked all 9, and never once said a word he did not need. Ingrid Halverson sent a crock of soured cabbage, with a note in careful English saying it was extra, and she did not want to see it wasted, and Marta kept it, and did not waste it. On the 4th day the wolves came at the flock in the willow bottom in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual, and Tam, the black and white bitch, who did all the real work of the ranch, went into them, and was opened along the flank from the last rib to the point of the hip. Baptiste carried her in. Wesley laid her on the kitchen table and reached for his knife, and Marta put her hand flat on his forearm and said, "No, she'll die slow. She'll die of the flies in July. It's January and it's clean." She was already going for her trunk. "Hold her head." She stitched the dog with linen embroidery thread boiled in the kettle and a curved needle out of her mother's tin, 41 stitches, and Nell Trenholm stood at the end of the table the entire time holding the lamp with both hands, and did not once let it shake. Afterward the girl sat on the floor with the dog's head in her lap for 2 hours, while the ether of it wore off, and Marta scrubbed the table, and Wesley stood in the doorway looking at his daughter with an expression Marta had not seen him wear. The dog lived. She limped for a month, and then stopped limping. By the end of January, the cellar was dug, lined, banked, and stocked, and the schedule was written out in 3 copies in Marta's hand. Craig read his copy standing in the yard with his mitts under his arm, for so long that Baptiste started to make a joke, and then didn't. "You've been running something all your life," Craig said. "My father kept a farm with 7 hands, a wife, 4 children, his mother, and a neighbor who came for dinner 3 days a week. How? He said if you have to watch a man to know what he's doing, the system is wrong. Make the thing plain enough that people can run themselves." Craig folded the paper into his coat. "Smart man," he said. "He was," she said, and the way she said it was the way she always said it, which was with a mixture of pride and grief so old and so worn that she had stopped identifying the second part as grief. It was simply the texture of the ground she stood on. February came in hard and stayed. There is a cold in that country that is not weather so much as a condition of the world, in which the snow squeaks like a floorboard underfoot and the horse's breath freezes on their whiskers into white staghorns, and metal will take the skin off a bare finger. The valley pulled in on itself and lived on the schedule. Each Friday Marta weighed out against the ledger with 2 witnesses. Nobody stole. Nobody had to. On the 9th of February, Baptiste's hand was crushed between a gate and a post when a heifer swung it, and he lost the use of the left one for 6 weeks. He had meant to winter with his sister at Pincher Creek. He had told them so in October, had said the word November about it, and he had said nothing more, and stayed, and none of them had asked him why, because they all knew, and there is a kind of asking that is only a way of making a man say a thing out loud that he has already done for you. Marta splinted the hand and cut his meat for him at the table for a fortnight and did not remark on any of it. And that was the month the man in the good coat came up the coulee. Marta was carrying water when the buggy came over the shoulder of the hill on the ice track, moving badly. 2 men. The one who got down was perhaps 50, with a beaver collar and a face arranged around a great deal of patience. The one who stayed in the buggy was younger and did not stop looking at the house. "Mrs. Bruckner," the man in the beaver collar said, and touched his hat, and she understood immediately that he had made it his business to know her name before he arrived, and that he had wanted her to know he had. "Lucian Vane, secretary of the Chinook Stock Association." He looked past her. "Is Wesley in the barn?" Wesley came out. The 2 of them talked in the yard for 11 minutes, and Marta stood at the corner of the house with the pails and listened to all of it. Vane was sorry about the wool market. Vane was sorry about the winter. Vane understood there had been an arrangement made among the Coulee families this year. which spoke very well of them, though he wondered whether it would carry to a second bad year, because the second bad year was the one that took a place. In his experience, Vane had an offer, which was not a good offer, and he said so himself, and said it with such regret that it took Marta a moment to notice he had said the number twice. "You've been clear," Wesley said. "I like to be. So have I. The number won't stay where it is," Vane said. "I want you to understand that. Come the spring, with the lease question and the trail question both to be settled, the number will be a different number." "What trail question?" Wesley said. Vane smiled at him with real warmth, the way you smile at a man who has just told you something you already knew. "Good day, Mrs. Bruckner," he said, and got into the buggy, and the younger man looked at her once more, and they went away down the ice track, with the buggy lurching, in a manner she found privately satisfying. That night after the girl was in bed, Wesley sat at the kitchen table with a letter he had taken out of a drawer, and did not open it, and turned it over twice, and set it down. "It came in December," he said. "Their first offer. In writing." He put his hands flat on the table on either side of it. "Ada's father broke this land. She's buried on the bench above the lambing shed. I've told myself all winter I'm holding it for Nell." He stopped. "And some nights I sit here and I do the sums. And the truthful thing is that if I sold in March, I'd have money in the bank and my girl would have a coat that fits, and neither of us would ever be cold again." Marta said nothing. She had learned that a man doing this must be permitted to finish. "Say something," he said. "What would you like me to say? Whether I'd be a coward? You'd be a man with money in the bank." She sat down across from him. "But you would not be able to explain to her in 10 years what the deciding thing was, because it wasn't the arithmetic. The arithmetic hasn't changed since December." He looked at her, and she saw something behind his face, open a little and stay open, and it frightened her more than the wolves had. There was a sound on the stairs. Nell was standing on the bottom step in her nightdress with her slate against her chest. She came across the kitchen and put the slate down on the table on top of the letter, and she had written on it, in the round, careful hand of a child who has not written a sentence in 2 years. "Mother made the fence." Then she stood there and waited, with her chin up, exactly the way her father stood when he had said a thing he intended to stand behind. Wesley Trenholm folded the letter along its old crease, and put it back in the drawer, and shut it, and he put his hand on the top of his daughter's head, and left it there, and none of the three of them said anything for a while. On the 28th of February, Marta did the accounting in the cellar, with the lantern hung on the nail, and found what she had been hoping to find. It would be close. The last 10 days of March would want the tightest weighing of the winter. But the numbers were not ambiguous. They were going to come through. She was wrong about what would nearly take the place. In the second week of March, with the eaves running and the snow going gray and sunken in the coulee bottom, a rider brought a printed notice from the Dominion Lands Office at Fort Macleod. The Chinook Stock Association had filed a petition asserting that the stock trail running along the north lip of Ninebark Coulee, the trail by which every sheep in the district went to the railhead, and by which the Halvorsons hauled hay, and Crake hauled oats, lay entirely within a grazing lease held by the association, and that continued use of it by sheep constituted trespass and injury to the range. Wesley read it twice in the yard, standing in the mud, and handed it to her without a word. "Can they do that?" he said. "I don't know the law well enough to answer." She read it a third time. "But I know that somebody in that office has been telling them things all winter, and a man who will tell you a thing will also help you file a paper. That trail's been there since before the ranch. Then it's on a survey plan somewhere," Marta said, "and the plan will say what it is. We need a lawyer. We need a clerk," she said. "A lawyer tells you what the paper means. A clerk tells you the paper exists." She was already pulling her shawl off the hook. Ingrid Halverson's brother works in the lands office. She mentioned it at Christmas. Wesley stared at her. That was 3 months ago. She said it once in passing about a Christmas card. "I remember most things," Marta said. "Is that a problem?" He almost smiled. "No," he said. "It isn't." Thorvald Nystrom was a small, exact man who took his position as clerk with an unmistakable seriousness, in the way of somebody who had come from a country where public offices are used as weapons, and who had decided that in his corner of this one they would be used as tools. He sat at the Halvorsons' kitchen table and listened to Marta lay it out, all of it, without interrupting. "I can look at the filings," he said at last. "That is not irregular. Any person may ask to see them. I'm not asking you to do anything irregular. I know, he said, and I am telling you it is not, so that neither of us has to say it again. He was gone 6 days. He came back with a copy of a plan and a copy of the petition and his hat in his hands. The association's petition rests on a survey of 1889, he said. The trail lies within the lease. That is true. Wesley sat back. But the lease of 1889 was struck over an earlier plan, Thorvald said, and on that plan the trail is not a trail. It is a road allowance. 66 feet, reserved to the Crown at the original township survey. A grazing lease cannot swallow a road allowance. It can only lie on either side of it. He set the paper on the table. It is a public road. It has been a public road since before Mr. Trenholm's wife was born. Then where is it? Wesley said. On the ground. If a road's been surveyed, there's an iron post and a mound. Yes, said Thorvald. There's no post on that lip. I've ridden it 1,000 times. Nobody spoke. And then Nell Trenholm got up from the corner where she had been sitting all evening and went out to the sleigh and came back with the tin box in which she kept 2 years of slates and drawings. And she went through them on the floor on her knees and pulled one out and put it in Marta's hands. It was drawn in pencil on the back of a seed catalogue, and it was dated in the corner in a child's hand, July. It showed the lip of the coulee and the willows, and a heap of stones with a squared iron post standing out of it at an angle, and along the flat of the post the girl had copied, in careful strokes, the numbers stamped there, the section, the township, the range. Marta held it under the lamp. Where is this? She said quietly. Nell. Where? The girl took the pencil out of her father's ledger and drew, on the corner of the same sheet, the shape of the ridge and the creek and a small square for the lambing shed, and put an X where a person could stand and see all three. The post was in the willow scrub 11 paces off the lip, tipped nearly flat, with 60 years of silt and sod grown over the mound. Craik found it in 20 minutes with a spade. Thorvald measured to it and wrote down the numbers and compared them with the plan and stood up in the wet grass and took off his hat, which was, from him, an oration. They filed the response on a Wednesday. It cited the township survey, the road allowance, the iron post, and its bearing and distance. It went into the public record, and once a thing is in the public record, no commissioner will carry a petition to hearing against it. Marta wrote 3 drafts of it at the kitchen table, and rewrote the third twice, because one clause was not precise, and Thorvald watched her do it with an expression of professional respect that she found flattering and slightly funny. 9 days later, a rider brought a letter from the office of the Chinook Stock Association, stating that, in view of changed circumstances, their offer for the Trenholm property was withdrawn, and wishing Mr. Trenholm well in his future endeavors. Enoch Purdy, who ran cattle on the bench and had voted with the association twice that winter, rode down into the coulee in April to say, awkwardly, holding his reins in both hands, and looking at the barn rather than at anybody, that he had not known about the road allowance business, and would not have stood for it, and that if Trenholm wanted the use of his shearing pens in June he could have them, and then he left before anyone could thank him properly. Baptiste watched him go and said, "That's what an apology looks like from a man who can't say the word. Is that it?" Wesley said, standing in the yard with the letter. "They just go. Men like that go where the money's easy," Craik said. "You stopped being easy." The shearing was in the 3rd week of May, in Purdy's pens, with Silas Bly at the wool table and Ingrid Halverson keeping the count, and the clip came off 1,106 sheep with the wool bright and even and no scab anywhere in it, not one animal. The buyers in Fort Macleod paid less than the wool was worth, because the market was still what it was, but they paid, and Wesley Trenholm paid off the note and the freight and the store account and had $92 left, which was $92 more than he had expected to have in his life again. He asked her in the shearing shed, of all places, with the lanolin thick on his hands, and the fleeces coming off the table in a slow yellow tide behind him. "I've been thinking about February," he said. "About what I nearly did." She waited. "I don't want you to stay because there's nowhere else. I want you to stay because this is where you'd choose." Marta wiped her hands on her apron. Outside, somebody was laughing at something. She could hear Nell's laugh among the others, which was a sound the girl had, though she had no words yet, a bright, unguarded sound that she had begun making somewhere around the middle of March. "Wesley," she said, "I walked 9 miles through snow to answer a piece of paper on a door. I have put everything I have into this coulee since the last week of October." She looked at him directly. When have I ever done anything here I did not choose? He looked at the floor of the shed and then at her. Then stay as my wife, he said. If you'll have me, yes, she said. They were married in June in the Halversons' front room by a Methodist minister who had ridden out from Fort Macleod, and Nell Trenholm stood beside Marta the whole time with a fistful of wild bergamot going limp in her hands. And afterwards in the yard, when the girl was standing at the fence watching the Bly children chase a hen that had escaped, and the hen turned and ran at them instead, Nell laughed and turned around and called across the yard, "Mama, look." 2 words. Nobody moved for a moment. Wesley Trenholm set down the glass he was holding on the fence rail very carefully, as though a sudden movement might frighten the words back where they had come from, and Marta stood where she was, and did not go to her, and did not weep, and said in a perfectly steady voice, "I see her." Then she went to her, late in the summer, with the second cut in the stacks and the coulee gone the color of a lion's hide. Marta walked up to the bench above the lambing shed where Ada Trenholm was buried, and pulled the wild rose back from the stone, and stood there a while with her hands hanging. She was 32 years old. She owned a trunk with a broken lock, a shawl, a whetstone, 4 good horn buttons, and her mother's book. Everything else in her sight belonged to a dead woman's husband, and would one day belong to a dead woman's daughter. And she found she could think this without any bitterness whatever, which surprised her, and then did not. She had come into this country with a husband and a wagon and a plan, and had lost all 3 inside of a year. What she had learned, standing over a boiling wash of lime and sulfur in November with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, was that the thing she had actually lost was not the wagon and was not the plan. It was the belief that she could build, and she had got that back, not from anyone's kindness, but from work. From 9 days of thawing frozen ground a foot at a time. From 41 stitches. From a schedule written out in 3 copies. That is the thing worth knowing about a person, she thought. Not what they are when the granary is full. What they are when the wool check comes back cut in half, and the scab is in the flock, and the men in good coats come up the trail with their patient faces and their papers. What they do when there is no good choice, only the least bad one. Whether they keep their hands on the work while the work is still hard. She had kept her hands on it. So had Wesley. So had Craik, who had never in his life admitted needing anything, and had put his oats in the cellar anyway. So had Baptiste, who had stayed. So had a 9-year-old girl who could not speak, and who had gone out in the summer of a bad year with a pencil, and drawn a rusted iron post in the willows because it interested her, and had saved a valley with it. The road allowance ran along the lip of the coulee where it had always run. The sheep would go down it to the railhead in the fall. In February, when the weather turned mean again, and it would because this was Alberta, and the weather always turned, there would be 4 families who already knew where the cellar door was and how to find it in the dark. Below her in the yard, Nell was talking to the dog. She talked to the dog more than to anyone, still, in long unbroken confidences that nobody was permitted to overhear. Wesley was walking up from the creek with a coil of wire over his shoulder, and he stopped and shaded his eyes and found Marta on the bench and lifted his hand. She lifted hers. Then she went back down the slope to the house, because the bread was rising and would want turning out, and there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. She was home.